Article 1, Section 3, the Senate. The Senate is the other house in Congress. The Senate seats its members equally. That means that each state gets 2 senators. So 2 times 50 means that we have 100 senators in the United States Senate. This is different from the House of Representatives, where the House seats people proportionally. That means that it depends on how many people you have, and they count population. In the Senate, each California senator represents about 34 million people, whereas each Wyoming senator represents only about 500,000. Each senator gets a 6-year term, and 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years. So every 2 years, a senator is elected into a class. And so when their 6-year term ends, they will be up for election with the rest of their class. So you can take a look at the pie chart and imagine each of the sections of the pie as 1/3 and 1 class. And so, I should say 1 class, or 1/3 of the pie. And so, when that particular section of the pie is up for re-election, is when that particular class is going to stand. The other 2 sections, the other 2 classes, will not be up for election in that year. So you can imagine 2012, for example, being the dark blue slice of the pie, 2014 being the light blue slice of the pie, and 2016 being the gray slice of the pie. You will only vote for your particular senator when his or her class comes up for election. So what that means is you may see senators in other states running for re-election, and your senator is not on the ballot. And that could be because your senator is not in that particular class. You may also have a situation where your 2 senators are not in the same class. And so you'll have elections for one of the Senate seats on one particular year and elections for the second seat on another year. There was a reason behind this. This was particularly put into the Constitution so that the popular majority could not wipe out the entire Senate at once. If it so happened that we were very upset with all of the senators, we could not vote them all out in one election. And in fact, it would take 6 years to completely renew the Senate if you wanted to erase everybody and start from scratch. The idea being that if the popular masses were upset about something or someone at the time, hopefully they would simmer down in 6 years and not want to get rid of everybody. But this makes changing the face of the Senate a very, very long process. Not only do they have 6-year terms, but it takes 6 years if you wanted to reinvent the entire Senate through election. As I mentioned, each state has 2 state senators. 2 senators for the state. I should differentiate that from the California legislature, which also has senators. The federal government in Congress, where we have senators, there are 2, and there are Senator Dianne Feinstein and Senator Barbara Boxer for the state of California. The U.S. Senate has the Vice President, believe it or not, as the President of the Senate. This is a quote from the Constitution. It says, "The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided." Our current Vice President is Joe Biden, and he is the President of the Senate. And so he doesn't actually get a vote. He is there and he presides over the Senate proceedings, but he won't get to vote on any of the Senate measures unless there is a tie. If there is a perfect tie, then Joe Biden gets to cast the tie-breaking vote. The Vice President is actually the only official who's a member of 2 branches of government. He's part of the executive branch because he's the Vice President, and he's part of the legislative branch through his job of President of the Senate. Another part of the Constitution says the Senate shall choose their other officers. By the way, that's their typo, not mine. It's actually written that way. Perhaps that was the way to spell it back in the time of the framing. The Senate shall choose their other officers, and also a president pro tempore, in the absence of the Vice President, or when he shall exercise the office of the President of the United States. We call this the President pro tem for short. And when the vice president is off doing other vice presidential things or attending to the president himself, then the president pro tem is the one who steps in and is the head of the Senate. Another important thing to know about the president pro tem is that the president pro tem is third in line for the presidency. So, remember I was talking about this line of succession. If something happened to the president, then the vice president would step in. The vice president is first in line for the presidency. If something happened to the vice president and the president, then you would have the Speaker of the House step in. And if all three of them were unable to perform the duties of the president, then the president pro tem of the Senate is the third in line and would assume the presidency. This is a picture of the Senate floor in Washington, D.C., so you can see all of the senators gathered together. You'll notice that it's very different from the House of Representatives floor in that it's much smaller, and you have everyone having individual desks. There are many fewer people on the floor. You still have the dais up in the front. You still have staff, but there isn't as clear, for example, a division up down the aisle, and you see a little bit more mixing here going on. This is also a great picture of being able to see the viewing gallery, which is up at the top with the yellow walls. Those folks are just watching what is going on at this particular session of the Senate. They don't participate in the actual proceedings, but they can watch what's going on. So now that we've met both houses, let's talk about the constitutional differences between the two. In terms of term, the Senate has a 6-year term. So each senator, as I mentioned before, is going to serve a 6-year term. In the House of Representatives, those representatives only serve 2-year terms. Of course, in both houses, they can be reelected. And so you'll see your representative on the ballot every 2 years. You'll only see your senator on the ballot once every 6 years, even though somebody may be on the ballot every 2. The minimum age for the House of Representatives is 25. You must be a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years in order to run, and you must live within the state. These are the qualifications for actually being a representative in the House of Representatives. Qualifications for being a senator, and these are part of what's called the qualifications clauses within the Constitution in this article, is that in order to be a senator, you must be at least 30 years of age, you must have been a citizen at least 9 years, and live in the state which you seek to represent. In terms of vacancies, if there is a vacant seat for some reason, a representative cannot fulfill their term, the governor can call a special election in order to fill that House of Representatives seat. In the Senate, it's a little bit different. The governor doesn't call a special election. The governor can actually appoint somebody. If the Senate is in recess at that time, then the president actually has the power to appoint someone to the Senate. In terms of apportionment of seats, as we mentioned before with the House of Representatives, this is going to change with population. And so every time we have a 10-year census, a decennial census, the number of representatives from each state may change depending on who picked up or who lost population. The Senate, on the other hand, is always fixed. It's always 2, and it's always representing the entire state. While we have districts that represent the House of Representatives, so for example, California is going to have several districts that are going to be redrawn through the process of redistricting, the Senate doesn't operate that way. Both of the senators are going to represent the entire state, not just their district, and that number is going to stay. It's always going to be 2, and it's not going to change even if population changes. Let's talk about the differences in constitutional powers when we're dealing with checks and balances. There are a couple of different powers which are allocated to the House and to the Senate. With regards to impeachment, it's actually a 2-step process. The House will impeach the official, and then the Senate actually does the trial of the impeached official. So the impeachment is just the beginning part of the process, and then they have to go to the Senate in order for the trial to commence. In terms of treaty-making power, the House has actually no authority, but the Senate is going to approve Any treaty that the president enters into, there must be a 2/3 vote of approval from the Senate in order for that treaty to go into place. In terms of presidential appointments, the House also doesn't have a check on the presidency. However, the Senate must approve any presidential appointments by a majority. In terms of organizational differences, there's definitely the size issue. The House has 435 voting members. You'll remember we spoke about the non-voting members as well. And the Senate has 100 members. And so if you were to be asked the question, how many members are in Congress, the correct answer would be to take both of these houses and add them together. So most people count 535. They don't count the non-voting members very often. The correct answer, if you were to be technical, would be 535 plus the non-voting members. In terms of standing committees, the House has a few more. They have 20 versus 16. And in terms of the workload, representatives would be assigned approximately 6 committees, which they would be sitting on in order to do work. And in the Senate, senators would be assigned approximately 11 committees each to sit on. In the House, there are limits on floor debate. With so many folks there, they have to give a certain time limit to how long certain matters can be discussed and how long you can speak, which is why you may be watching C-SPAN and see something like someone up there saying, "And I yield the balance of my time to the gentlewoman from California." That means that they're giving the remainder of the time they had to speak to somebody else, so that person can use that time to speak since they are timed. In the Senate, on the other hand, we don't see this. There's actually no limits on floor debate, which is why we have a mechanism in the Senate called the filibuster. You may have heard of this before. The filibuster is one party's way, oftentimes the majority, of continuing floor debate and just talking and talking and talking, hoping to wear the other side down so that the vote goes in the way that they want it to go. Interesting thing about the filibuster is that as long as you continue talking, there is no time limit on how long you can go, and there's absolutely nothing which says what you have to talk about. And so there have been instances in the past where senators have gone up and actually read the phone book into the record of the Senate in order to continue speaking, and so they could use this as a tool to wear down the majority party. Yes, you heard that right, your tax dollars at work. There have been many attempts to abolish the filibuster. Of course, whoever the majority at the time doesn't like that tactic. They see it as bullying and as something which wastes time and money and effort. But of course, it is a tool of the minority party when they're not able to get enough votes in to try to get the majority party to cave or at least come to the negotiating table where they would change a little bit of what the particular bill is, which is making the minority party unhappy.